This episode is brought to you by Absolute Landscapes. Absolute Landscapes is a landscape maintenance company that focuses heavily on commercial property maintenance. Call today for information about the services we provide and how we can best help you. 803-427-5944.
All right. So if you want to introduce yourself and kind of say who you are and what you do,
Sure.
and lead us into the conversation, we'll go from there.
Sounds good. Hi, I am Andrea Troughton. I'm an anti-diet personal trainer and holistic nutrition coach, and I'm also a recent author. And I live in Edmonton, Canada. And my belief is that vulnerability is my most powerful tool when it comes to coaching and helping others. And I focus most specifically on coaching people to build better relationships with themselves, better relationships with food, with exercise, and with their bodies through joyful movement, mindful eating, and habitual self care.
All right. So you said nutritional, and what was that other coach?
Uh,
What was the other
anti
one?
anti diet personal trainer and holistic nutrition coach.
Okay.
hmm
Um, so what do you mean by holistic nutrition?
Yeah, so I studied holistic nutrition here in Edmonton, and what that essentially comes down to is looking at nutrition as part of the puzzle when we're trying to really see the whole person. So, holistic truly just means like whole, like embodying every aspect of the person's being. So, while nutrition is like the tool that we use, we also look at it in the context of their mental well-being, emotional well-being, spiritual well-being, and like their general, like the whole picture of their lives instead of just being
Mhm.
like, okay, we're going to focus in on nutrition. We use nutrition as a tool, but we focus on the whole person and other aspects of their experience.
Okay, that's interesting because like even before I met you, I've been saying that I feel like fitness is like a cornerstone for your life because it's like so many it influences so many other areas of your life. And so from what it sounds like with you is like you look at not only the nutrition but also the mental how did you word it? The mental health, is that what you used?
Yeah, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being, as well as
Okay.
physical well-being.
Okay. And you just kind of look at all those things and you kind of I guess you maybe work with people on in all those areas to kind of I don't know, I don't want to assume.
Yeah, yeah. So essentially, it's kind of like looking at all areas of a person's life, and then you can use nutrition, exercise, whatever tools, but you're kind of trying to help not only improve maybe that whole spectrum of someone's life, like all of those areas, but also
Mhm.
you're looking to understand those areas so that way, whatever my recommendations are or whatever my approach is actually reasonable for the person's life and it's not like taking them from like here to way over here without any kind of understanding of what they need and what their day-to-day life is.
Okay. So if you had to like if there was like an ideal client situation that you have, what do you think that like what do you see a lot of as far as like the people that you work with? Like what's maybe like a typical situation for you guys?
Yeah, so for me personally, I work with a lot of clients who are either new to exercise, like, or they're really unfamiliar or uncomfortable in the gym setting, or who have maybe struggled with disordered eating or other disordered relationships with their body. So I'm really
Hmm.
working with people who are kind of not feeling comfortable in their body, not feeling comfortable kind of getting started in, health and fitness. And I'm really trying to help bridge that gap and make those things really accessible to them by kind of removing some of that intimidation factors that people often experience when they're stepping foot in the gym or trying to change habits. So for me, a lot of those clients are often women. I do work with a few men, but more often than not, I'm seeing women, kind of a broad spectrum of ages, anywhere from like their early 20s to their 50s, 60s. Um, but yeah, it's mostly working on those like initial habits and that initial comfort with themselves and comfort with what they're doing to kind of get them building those habits on their own.
Yeah. Man, I can't imagine like so when I started working out, I was working out at home for like the first year. before I joined the gym. And then
Mhm.
even when I joined the gym, I was like, a year into the fitness journey, and I felt like I was making some sort of progress, but I was still like uncomfortable going into the gym. So I can't imagine like what a person feels if they just like go to the gym day one, if they're just like, if they have not done any kind of fitness plan whatsoever, and then they just immediately go into the gym. I mean, I can only imagine, like, yeah, I think you used the right word, intimidating.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like even with myself, when I first started working out, like I didn't start going to the gym until I was in my mid 20s, or early mid 20s anyway. And I'd never really been there before. And I hired a personal trainer, and I did not go to the gym without an appointment with my personal trainer for at least a year before I was even like willing or like confident enough to like try it on my own. And even then, I like still needed somebody else to kind of like give me a program, guide me through things, and it was still pretty nerve wracking even in those first like even in that like second year after I'd worked with a trainer. So like my goal when I work with clients is to hopefully not make them rely on me for as long. Like I want to build independence and self-efficacy so that they can take these habits on their own.
Right.
But yeah, it's like the gym can be super intimidating, and like changing anything in your life can be super intimidating if it's unfamiliar or not your comfort zone, right?
Oh, for sure.
Hmm.
So what do you think it is? Like, what is it about it that's intimidating? Is it just because like it's something new, or do most of these people feel like, they're just going to be judged for being there? Like, what do you think it is that makes it this such an intimidating thing for people?
I think that's a really good question because I think it can be different from for different people, but how it seems to me from a lot of the clients that I've talked to is it's intimidating partly because yeah, I think a lot of people are afraid of being judged. They're afraid that like they're going to walk into the gym and there's going to be all these like fit, strong people who are there all the time looking at them like, oh, you don't know what you're doing, or I think a lot of people are afraid of like not knowing what they're doing, looking stupid, being judged. But I think there's also a level of like fear around not succeeding, or hurting themselves or any of those other things that can be really like daunting too. They're like, oh, like if I don't know what I'm doing, like I'm probably going to hurt myself, or I'm probably going to like screw up and I'm not going to succeed. So I think there's like a combination of like fear of what other people think, and then also like
Hmm.
fear of whether or not they actually think that they can do this themselves.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point, because I feel like that makes a lot of sense, is what I'm
Hmm.
trying to say. Because I think when people get into the gym, I think I'll say this, man. I don't see a lot of people like focusing on other people at the gym the way I think a lot of people think they do, or
Yeah.
at least not in the way, at least not in that way. I mean, and this is coming from somebody who's been in the gym, for a couple years now. But I don't know, man. The message I try to send to people is like, yeah, I know it feels like people are going to be looking at you, but really, if they're doing what they're supposed to do, they're not going to be worried about anybody but themselves. They need to be focused on their own workout. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's true. Like I think most of the time, most people at the gym, especially if they're comfortable themselves, like they're just
Hmm.
there doing their thing, paying attention to what they're doing, like not really paying attention to each other. I think there's like, the internet has had more than enough videos of like people who've been like videoed in the gym doing something that and
Hmm.
then gets made fun of. And I think that like fact that that exists at all can be a really big like fear. Like people are worried that that's going to happen to them, even if it is like actually a really small minority. I think it creates enough fear that even though like I've never seen anybody doing something like filming somebody that they shouldn't be or whatever in the gym personally, but I think the fact that that's out there is like a pretty big fear for some people. Like they're going to get stared at, they're going to get caught doing something that they don't know what they're doing or whatever.
Yeah, the crazy thing is, man, there's a certain type of human that will like film somebody who's trying to improve themselves and get
Hmm.
like some sort of enjoyment out of that. There's just like a certain type of person. Like you have to be a special person, and I'm using the word special easily here for to take part in something like that.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree.
I, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to agree with you. Like I think that like that's definitely like the minority of people, and like
Hmm.
not a cool thing to do, but it is unfortunately sometimes does happen.
Um, you mentioned something earlier about vulnerability
Mhm.
as part of your like your I don't know if it's your main message or the main way you do things. What can you refresh me on that? You mentioned the word vulnerability.
Yeah, yeah. So I mentioned that I think that's kind of like one of my most powerful tools as like a coach or as somebody who's trying to help other people. I've recently published a book where I share my sort of personal journey through mental health, grief, a lot of other things, as well as my relationship with like disordered eating and exercise. And I shared a lot of that. Um, and then also in the book, I share some of the tools and strategies I've used to kind of overcome those things. And I think that in my like most recent experience in like writing the book and also like working with the type of clients that I've been working with, like I think being open and vulnerable with my own struggles and my own feelings about things has been a really powerful tool in like connecting to my clients and connecting to other people
Mm,
and helping them see that like this isn't they're not alone in how they feel. So that's kind of where I lie with that. Like vulnerability is a big value for me in terms of how I present myself and how I connect with other people.
yeah. Well, so there's a couple points there. I feel like if you show your clients or other people your own vulnerability, that makes it seem like where you're at or where they want to be can be real. Because I think a lot of times, man, we see somebody who's like maybe farther along a path that we want to be on or a similar path or whatever. And I think if we're at the starting point, it's easy for us to put those people on a pedestal as if they have something that we don't, or if they have opportunities or talents or abilities that we don't. And I think when you hear about those person's vulnerabilities and their own kind of downfalls getting to this point, I think it makes the like where you're trying to go, the goal you're trying to have more real, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, I
Or more
think so.
accessible, I should say.
Yeah, I agree. Like
Yeah.
it's like you know, when you can see somebody like beyond it's like kind of the like the whole Instagram vibe of things where like most people
Hmm.
publish like the most polished versions of themselves. And, you know, a lot of people see that sort of thing and they're like, oh, like that person's got blah, 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 blah. They're doing so great or whatever. But what happens behind the scenes is often what people don't see. And I think that's like that vulnerability of like showing what's happened behind the scenes, showing what, you know, all taken place to get this person from A to B does make like the goals or like the habits or whatever seem more achievable to somebody else,
Hmm.
but I think it also like makes them feel like, oh, like I'm not the only one who had this struggle, and it makes things feel like more realistic.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I think too, if we put somebody on a pedestal like that and we say this person can do things, has abilities that I don't, whatever, I think that is a way that we sabotage ourselves basically by this belief that's not even a real thing,
Mhm.
because we think, like, you see this a lot with like celebrities or like professional athletes or whatever. It's like these people have something that I don't or whatever.
Mhm.
And I understand talent and all that kind of thing, but like that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is we see people who are like farther along in this thing than we are, and it's just so easy for us to say that I don't have whatever it takes to be at that level. But like when you break it down and you see what this person's overcome and you talk to this person like on a real level, it makes it all more, it's not so much of a uh not accessible thing, I guess is the way to put it.
Yeah.
And then something else too I wanted to say about the vulnerability is like, if you are comfortable with your own vulnerabilities, that shows you where your weaknesses are and where you need to improve.
Mhm.
Because if all I feel like if all we're doing is like constantly, using the the strong areas that we have. I mean, I understand that. I understand that you can capitalize on those areas, but it's like if you don't know where you're vulnerable at and weak at, how do you know what to improve?
Yeah, that's true too. I think it's like valuable. It's valuable for like people outside of yourself to see vulnerability in
Hmm.
others, but I think you're right. It is also really valuable to like check in with your own situations and your own vulnerability and be like, okay, what can I work on?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have to have a starting point.
Hmm.
And I don't think you can have that starting point if you don't know where you're currently like quote unquote weak at.
Yeah, it's true.
But I mean, like this whole vulnerability thing, man, like this is like, people say that if you show emotion or whatever like that shows a vulnerability and that shows a weakness, but like it's actually a very strong, it's actually takes a lot of strength for a person to be vulnerable around other people, because I mean, by definition, that makes it more likely that they're open to some sort of attack from a person. If they're being vulnerable and open to people, that's actually a sign of strength.
Yeah,
And so
totally.
I disagree when people say that if you never show your vulnerabilities or weaknesses, that's a sign. I disagree with that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like vulnerability, um, it takes a lot of guts and courage
Yeah.
to expose yourself in some way. So if you are able to do that and still like stand firm in it, like that's definitely a really strong feature.
And something else too, that like anything that people have built that is like worth having, whether it's a relationship or a business or a career, like the first time you take a step towards that thing, you're going to be, because you don't know, you're going to be vulnerable, so you don't know what the outcome is. You're risking these things, whatever your time or your attention or whatever it is for these things, resources, and the outcome is not guaranteed. So anything that we do, like anything, if you talk to a person and they are in a have a thing in life, whatever it is, a career, relationship, whatever it is, it started out with vulnerability. I feel like it started out like being in that vulnerable position and still continuing forward. Because you mentioned something earlier about the comfort zone, man, and we cannot grow. I know it sounds so cliche and it sounds so motivational speaky, but you can't grow in the comfort zone. Like you can't. If you stay comfortable, you're always going to be in the same place.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of funny you say that. Like the title of my book is called Choose Your Discomfort, and sort of the concept
Hmm.
behind that is, for me, it's the idea of like there's discomfort kind of no matter what. Like sometimes the comfort zone is comfortable not because it's like everything's great there, but it's because it's familiar and it feels safe. But there's
Yep.
still discomfort in that because sometimes that like means you're not growing, you're not moving forward or whatever. Whereas like there's also a lot of discomfort in changing or pursuing something different or like stepping outside of that comfort zone. So like for me, that concept is like just choosing which type of discomfort you are willing to work through, willing to sit with, and what's going to serve you in the long run. So for some people, like staying in the comfort zone isn't going to serve them in the long run if they have other goals, if they have, something they want to achieve. But for other people, maybe like getting out of the comfort zone is like actually feels really dangerous. So they're like, maybe I'll hold back. But for me, it's like you got to choose which type of being uncomfortable you're going to actually benefit from in the long run.
So yeah, you were saying about your book, the title of your
Okay.
book, and why that made you think of that.
Yeah,
You were
yeah. So the title of my book is Choose Your Discomfort. Oh, sorry.
no,
We're
you're
good?
good. Yep.
Okay, okay. Yeah, the title of my book is Choose Your Discomfort. So it kind of came about while talking about like situation where sometimes like the comfort zone that we have is not necessarily like comfortable because it's like positive for us. It's more or less can be comfortable because it's like familiar or safe or doesn't feel like we're taking any risks. Whereas like so there's discomfort there potentially, but there's also often discomfort in the idea of like changing or stepping outside of that zone or like doing something different. And so that idea for me kind of comes down to just being able to consciously choose like which type of discomfort I
Hmm.
personally am willing to sit through, deal with, and also which one's gonna serve me or like, benefit me in the long run. Maybe staying in my comfort zone has some benefits because like I don't have to take any risks, but it's also not necessarily helping me move forward or grow or do whatever it is that I'm trying to do. So being able to like actively choose like which one of these is benefiting me is kind of the idea that I really like to focus on. Like for some people, maybe that comfort zone is like safe for a reason, and so like they choose to stay there, and that
Hmm.
benefits them to a certain degree. And then maybe later on, you choose like being uncomfortable by stepping outside of it. But it's kind of that I know I really like that concept of being able to consciously choose and like there's discomfort all around us. It's always going to be something's going to be uncomfortable. It's just a matter of like making conscious decisions about which type or why you are willing to deal with that type of discomfort.
Yeah. Man, I love that. That's so good because that is 100% true. Like it doesn't matter like it's going to be uncomfortable either way. Either it's
Mm-hmm.
going to be uncomfortable to make the change and make the decision to make the improvement, or if you stay comfortable in the long run it's going to be uncomfortable. And I love that because it is this is one of the things that really like bothers me, man. This mindset about immediate gratification and like what feels good right now in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like if you do something like if it's like a fitness plan, or if you're trying to develop a career that is going to be good for you, or a business, or a long-term relationship, or whatever it is, it might be uncomfortable in the beginning, but like what happens if you don't do these things? Like what's the alternative? What happens if you
Yeah.
don't do it? You're going to be in the same spot, 10, 15, 20 years later. And that's going to be way uncomfortable than it's going to be to try to, get through the first little bit of it. I mean,
Yeah.
and it's such a good thing, because it's such a good thing that you say that, because this is 100% true. It's going to be uncomfortable either way. Like
Mm-hmm.
either way you do it, no matter what you do, what you're trying to improve, you can either, I love the way you said this. You can choose how it's going to be not, it's going to be uncomfortable for you. You can choose your discomfort.
Yeah,
I love that.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, and that's one thing that I try to like, that's one thing that I myself, I think I really try to focus on, because like I do things like the ice bath, the things like that, and that thing sucks, dude. That thing sucks. But it's like
Yeah.
when you get like, as you're getting in there, you're getting in feet first, and it's like you have to first of all, you have to consciously make the decision to get in the thing, and then you get in feet first, and you have to like sit down in it basically, and it's like it's like every part of that thing until you get out sucks. But afterwards, like the effects you get afterwards, like for the mental effects, the physical effects, it all makes it worth it. So it's like 3 minutes of discomfort for an entire day of productivity, or general well-being, or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
um Dude, if there was one thing like, I don't want to get off on a rabbit hole here, but if there was one thing that I had to do every day consistently, if I could just choose one thing, it's hard to say if it would be, it's hard to say. I don't know. The ice bath would be a really hard thing to not choose,
Yeah.
because man, it's like everything: physical recovery, mental well-being, emotional well-being. When you're in it and adrenaline is pumping through your system, it kind of you can train your body how to react when you're under a stressful situation or under pressure. And so that's
Mm-hmm.
one thing I like about it. Anyways, there's a whole host of benefits from that thing. Um, okay, so let me change gears here for a second.
Sure.
You were talking about this healthy relationship with food, and this is something I'm
Mm-hmm.
interested in, man, because I myself, fortunately, I feel like I have a generally healthy relationship to food. And so when we say an unhealthy relationship to food, I've had a guest on here before who's talked about this thing, and it's like it's hard for me to imagine that, because it's something that's so basic and primal, and something that's so fundamental to our life. Like I can't imagine having an quote unquote unhealthy relationship with it. And
Mm-hmm.
the things I've heard in the past are things like people see food as like an enemy, or they see their relationship with food as like something that how would you say it? Something that like they just has a grasp or a hold on them or whatever. It's just like the food is in control. I don't know. It's there's all these different words that people use, and I'm like, dude, I don't have the words. I don't know what to say to this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I mean, it's awesome to have a great relationship with food because it is such an important part of our lives. Like we
Hmm.
literally need it to stay alive and to be able to function at all without having, food or like a reasonable way of eating that works for you, like it can be really detrimental to our health. But so having a bad relationship with food can really impact you, not just like because the relationship with food can be a mental strain and be difficult on you, but also like it can impact your physical health. It can impact so many other areas of your life. And it's like there's a lot of reasons that can happen with somebody. A lot of the time, like in my experience, I see that happening with a lot of people who've been on a like yo-yo dieting for most of their life, where they're on a diet, off a diet, on a diet, off a diet, and
Hmm.
or they see a lot of body fluctuations, and that causes them a lot of stress, and then they use food to control it or whatever. And I think I mentioned this when we spoke before, but even like sometimes, in situations where people don't feel like they have a lot of control in life, sometimes they'll exert that control over eating, which can
Hmm.
also damage their relationship with food. Whereas like, what you're eating is always something that you're actively choosing or controlling, unless, you're a small child and your parents provide you food or whatever. But in most cases, like that's like a personal choice and personal decision. And sometimes when people don't have or feel like they have a lot of control in life, they exert additional control over food. And so, like, a lot of different circumstances can lead someone to develop an unhealthy relationship with food. I see it a lot with women, because I mean, the unfortunate truth is like society is really hard on women and how their bodies look and stuff like that. So there's a lot of women who deal with that. It's not exclusive to women. Absolutely, like men have that struggle too. But just from my like lens of who I work with, that's where I see it a lot. But yeah, it's like having an unhealthy relationship with food can look like a lot of things. Like for some people, it can look like constantly feeling like they need to be on a diet or they're doing something wrong. For other people, it can feel like they are putting a lot of like judgment on themselves, where it's like,
Hmm.
oh, like this food is bad and this food is good, and if I eat this bad food, then like I'm a terrible person, and then they like shame themselves and they can spiral from there. There's like situations where like maybe they're not necessarily exerting sum- like tons of control over what they eat, but instead what they're doing is like excessively exercising to compensate for it. And they're like, I ate this stuff, so now I have to punish myself with exercise. So there's like a lot of different things that can look like, and different people will have different experiences with it. But kind of ultimately, what it comes down to, the way I see it anyway, is like when you have a bad relationship with food, like food or eating causes you stress instead of, helping, like, nourishing your body should help you then manage stress
Hmm.
and manage your life a little bit better. Whereas instead, having that unhealthy relationship with food actually like adds more stress to your life.
So this is really interesting to me. The people that you work with, or this, maybe the situations that you've seen where there's unhealthy relationship with the food, is it is it that people are not eating enough, or they're eating too much, or like is it maybe a mix, an equal mix, or like what do you think?
I'd say it's probably an equal mix. Like there's and sometimes it's like a mix within the same person. Like some people will be like excessively under eating. Um, some
Hmm.
people will binge eat. Some people will have periods of under eating and periods of binging. Like there's often a little bit of both, and sometimes even people who are eating an appropriate amount of food for their body and for their activity level and all of that stuff can still have a negative relationship with food, because it's not necessarily about how much or how little they're eating, but it's how their choices are making them feel like mentally. They're like, maybe they're eating the exact amount of food that is appropriate for them, but they feel like stressed about it all the time or something like that. So it can be like a really big spectrum in how that presents.
Okay.
Hmm.
So the reason I'm asking is, I feel like we hear a lot about is anorexia. Is that right? The Where
That's
people are like really
where they're like severely under eating.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's like one of the like diagnosable titles for a fairly common eating disorder, and that's usually like all about restricting calories.
Yeah. So I mean, I hear a lot about this, but I've never heard, and I'm sure it's out there. I don't know if there's a term for it or not, but what I'm trying to say is we hear a lot about that end of the spectrum, like under eating,
Hmm.
to the point to where it's almost like these people can't see. It's almost like they don't see a problem with what's going on here.
Hmm.
But is there something on the other side of the spectrum where like a person is overeating to the same degree, and they also don't see, I don't want to say anorexic people don't see an issue, but I'm saying like it's hard. From what I've seen and the people I've talked to that have overcome anorexia, it's like this is a belief they have. Like it's like no matter what you say to them, this is what they believe, and so this is so it's just really hard to get out of this cycle. But like on the opposite end of the spectrum, is there something? is there like a term for that? Like, is there like a
Yeah,
person who,
like I mean, I'm not maybe the most qualified person to speak to it because like this, there's a lot of like diagnostic criteria when it comes to like eating disorders are considered like mental health disorders. So like
right, yeah.
anorexia is one diagnosable eating disorder. There's also binge eating disorder, which is a diagnosable one. That one tends to be more in regards to like people over consuming. But sometimes that will not necessarily be like all the time they're over consuming. Sometimes it's like
Hmm.
they're, eating normal, and then they have a binge episode. So there's like kind of differences. I'm not sure. Um, there's also like so there's like the diagnosable eating disorders that have names and are like listed in the medical manuals. But then there's also like just disordered eating, which is a bit more of a
Hmm.
general blanket term that kind of can cover over like a lot of different behaviors. Um, Whereas, because like sometimes there's the diagnostic criteria where it's like, okay, this person is anorexic because they have this, and this. Sometimes there's people who have like, these two things here and these two things here, and it doesn't technically make them diagnosable, but they're still struggling, they're still suffering, they're still having a disordered eating situation, but it might not fall into this category or that category. So it's kind of hard to say exactly, but there's definitely like
Hmm.
different ends of the spectrum.
So uh, this is really, now that I'm thinking about this, man, I've never like thought about this to this level, but this is kind of sad to me because I feel like when a person is like under eating versus a person that's overeating, and I'm not talking about just like a couple pounds underweight or a couple pounds overweight. I'm talking about the extremes, like where
Hmm.
it would be a diagnosable thing. It seems like we have more compassion and we blame the mental disorder for the person who's like severely under eating. And then if it's the person who's severely overeating, it's like society wants to blame the person and not the disorder. And I feel like that's so unfair, man, because if it's like if you, I mean, it's the disorder is what's causing this. Like that disordered eating is what's causing this, is what it sounds like. And so like, why can't we look at it as, if we're going to talk about anorexia and talk about people under eating to that point, like we really want to like get to the bottom of that and help that person with that mental disorder. But it's like if the same person is in the opposite direction with a disorder, you could say the same disorder, it's just manifests itself in a different way. Why are we not also trying to help that person's disorder instead of just, automatically assuming it's the person's fault?
Hmm.
Am I making sense here?
Yeah, absolutely. And like that's super common. And actually, like kind of to add another layer to it, there's also a lot of times where somebody is under eating and like their behaviors fall in line with like an anorexic diagnosis, but they might still be in a bigger body. And often they too don't get recognized, or like their struggle isn't recognized because people don't visually, they don't look at you and you're like, oh, you have an eating disorder. They're just like, have other judgments. And like truthfully, I think a lot of that comes down to this concept of fat phobia, which is like basically a discrimination against people who are in bigger bodies or who have, more weight to carry. And a lot of time that comes like that shows up in like the medical field, it shows up in like fitness, it shows up in like society, whereas like somebody who's existing in a larger body faces a lot more judgment and a lot more like shaming about their eating than somebody who shows up in a much smaller body, even if they have very, very similar struggles. And I think it's getting better now, like from my realm of experience and like the kind of clientele I talk to, like there are more people that I'm engaging with that like are understanding that. But I think it's a lot harder for people to get help or to be recognized as, have struggling with disordered eating when they don't look the specific way that people imagine somebody with an eating disorder looks. And I think that often is where people who have like more of a binge eating disorder or something like that often get sort of blamed themselves for the problem, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I think That does make sense, man. I think it's important for us to realize that like not everybody has the same starting point with these things. You know,
Hmm.
like there are people who their genetics are going to make it easier for them to, get into a fitness plan or a fitness, program or whatever. And like this, the mentality of this is huge. Like if a person, I'm a big believer that being active or some sort of movement or being in the gym or just getting outside and seeing the sunlight. I'm a big believer that these things will, I'm not going to say they will cure depression because I'm not a psychologist. I don't know, but they will alleviate the depressive symptoms. I'm sure.
Hmm.
However, there are there are people who have different starting points, man. Like there are people, fortunately for me, I'm not a person who's experienced like depression to a point where it would be clinical. But I've had people that are close to me in my family and friends who are in that, have been in that space. And it's like this person's mentality is at a difference. Like this mental disorder or health situation, whatever you want to call it, is an obstacle for them along this path.
Hmm.
And different people might have that in different areas to different degrees. Maybe they don't have that. Maybe they have another obstacle to overcome. But like everybody has their own subjective obstacles to overcome, and not everybody starts at the same point. And so, what I'm getting at here that I wish people in the and I want to say I've never heard like a trainer or somebody who's like a very avid gym goer, somebody who's exceptionally fit. I've never heard them make statements about a person who is either not fit or has some sort of eating disorder or whatever. I've never heard any statements that would be like derogatory in any kind of way. But I'm just saying, I wish the fitness world would take into consideration that what works for you might not work for another person because this person has a completely different starting point.
Hmm.
Going back to what we were saying earlier about how you share your experiences with your clients, I think that's everything, because what you can do, somebody might not have the exact same starting point, but they might have a similar starting point or similar obstacles than you. And I think this is what is important about everybody sharing their story. And it doesn't even have to be fitness, it's about anything in life.
Hmm.
This is why it's important for everybody to share their story, because there's somebody on a similar level that had a similar starting point to you that can really benefit from your story. Because if I tell somebody my story, like if I'm talking to somebody who has like what you're talking about, this unhealthy relationship with eating, I'm not going to know what to say to that person because I was never in that spot. So it's like I can say something to them. I can try to be, the most inspirational person, whatever, but to a certain level, it's not really going to matter because it's not going to resonate with them because my story is a little bit different than theirs.
Yeah.
It was also too, like when I started working out, I was more of a leaner guy. So I was trying to put on weight versus taking weight off. So even that's different. Like it would be hard for me to talk to a person who's trying to get into the gym just to lose weight because I don't know. I mean, I'm sure I could talk to them, I could say stuff to them, but I don't have that experience to share with them. So they're not going to resonate with me the way they would somebody who, lost 50 pounds or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Like I think like when we look at like kind of the fitness industry as a whole, like I do think it's improving in terms of like seeing people as like individuals and like, cut and paste things won't work for everybody. Um, but I think like in my line of work working with clients, like the most important thing that I think I can do to actually help someone is to try and meet them where they're at. Whereas like when I first got into the industry, like I've been a personal trainer for almost 10 years now, and when I first started, I think like sort of the vibe and like the mindset behind, selling people on personal training was very much like you want to get them in and have them come in as often as possible in the beginning, and then over time you want to like wean down, or like, ideally you get them in like, 3, 4 times a week to come see me, and then over time they can start doing, like 1 or 2 days by themselves and 1 or 2 days with me, and vice and so on. Whereas like now my approach is completely opposite, where like I see somebody and I want to make sure I meet them where they're at. I want to be like, okay, what are you doing right now? Like, what feels good to you? What feels doable? Let's start with this like small piece, and then you build up from there instead of like trying to jump in head first and then like balance it out. And so like I think the idea of like meeting people where they're at, being like, okay, what are your obstacles? What are your barriers? Like, what are you dealing with that makes this stuff hard for you? And finding like little ways to create change, I think is really important. But I do think like that concept of like sharing your story with somebody, like even for me, like, I had a similar experience when I started working out. Like I was really, really slender. I was always like one of those like teenagers that people would be like, oh, you should probably eat a burger kind of vibe. And so like when I started
Mm-hmm.
working out, the same thing. I was very slender, and I don't necessarily claim to be able to relate to one of my clients' experiences who's a bigger person who, has all the insecurities or all the feelings that are associated with that. But I can share other parts of my experience where I have felt badly about myself, or I have felt, similar feelings, maybe to a different experience, and people can still relate to that. And I think that's really valuable to be like, I felt this way. Maybe it's different, but also being able to accept like my limitations and be like, I haven't been in that situation, and that sounds really hard. So like kind of finding the
Right.
balance between sharing my story in a way to try and connect with people and make them feel like understood, but also being able to be like, I haven't experienced that, and that sounds hard, and like validating that person's experience, even if I haven't had
Yeah. Well, that makes a big difference, man. Like I think the validation makes a big difference um, because I don't want to go there. Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this about this identity thing, because I feel like identity is huge. I was just talking to a recent guest about this, and we were talking about identity. Like, you can talk to a person, I can talk to a person, anybody can talk to them, but I think at the end of the day, it's going to come down to what these people believe. You can share your story with somebody, you can try to help them. What do you see in the people that you work with as far as like identity? Whereas if it's something they think about themselves, it's kind of holding them back. Like, if it's a person that's overweight, do they just is that just how they see themselves, or do they see themselves as a what is it? Do they see themselves as a person who is just a fit person who is overweight, or do they see themselves as overweight? Because I think there's a difference. I think if you can see yourself, what am I trying to say here? If you can see yourself as a person who is not, whose physical fitness is not what you want it to be, that implies that you can reach that point. Versus if you're just a person who is, oh, I am this weight and that's just how I am and that's just how it's going to be, these are just my genetics. I think that's a very different thought process.
it. Yeah, I think I know what you mean. Like, there's kind of a few different ways that I will look at it where, like, definitely, I think that like limiting beliefs, when you believe a certain thing about yourself, and you're set in that way, then that's how you're going to be. I think that that's definitely, like, people are often unlikely to change or pursue growth or create, different things in their life if they are stuck in the belief like, this is how I am, this is what I am, this is how I'm always
Mm.
going to be. However, I also have this sort of perspective now working like with the type of clients that I work with where, I wouldn't necessarily say that there's anything. I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with somebody being like, I identify as like being a fat person or being like a bigger person, because I think there's also a lot of power in like seeing yourself as you are and being okay with that and being like, yeah, I have fat. So what? I also have this, this, this. I have these other qualities. And having, or like, being a bigger person doesn't mean that they can't also be get in good shape, or be strong or be fast or whatever. Like, it doesn't necessarily, like, you don't have to be identified, you don't have to see yourself differently than you are to still also achieve other things. It's as long as you don't see yourself this one way and be like, that's it, this is a bad thing and I am this bad thing. If you can be like, I can see myself,
Mm-hmm.
in my body the way my body is, and be like, I'm okay with me, but I can also take better care of myself. I can also do these other things. And I think people have better success when instead of trying to be like, I need to change, like so my clientele, I really don't focus too much on like changing body shape or changing aesthetics, like unless that person is like that's what they want. But even still, I really approach it from like a, let's try and like show you, let's try and make you feel like you deserve to be as you are, where you are, doing what you're doing, no matter what you look like. But let's also take care of you. Let's also do these other things that will benefit you. Maybe you'll lose weight, maybe you won't. It really depends on a lot of other things, like the body the body will change weight. Like different people's bodies will respond to different things. Like we've talked about that. Everybody's different. So I try and pursue it more of like a let's change the behaviors. Let's achieve things
Hmm.
regardless of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. I feel like that, the way a person believes about themselves or whatever they believe is possible for them or they're capable of or they're worthy of or
Hmm.
whatever. I think that's going to dictate what they do or do not
Yes.
do, to go towards these goals or not towards these goals. And this is, this kind of conversation gets into like limited beliefs and, core beliefs and things that kind of hold you back. Which we might touch on here in a little bit. But Andrea, let's do this. Let's take a break just for
Sure.
a second, and then we'll pick back up. All right. So we were talking about these like core beliefs and these limiting beliefs and stuff. What's your thoughts on that, man? Because I feel like I love asking people this because it's sometimes you get like in the same ballpark of the answer, but sometimes the answers are very different. So, like, just what do you think about limiting beliefs and these core beliefs that kind of hold us back, or if they're a positive belief? I mean, this is another thing too. We always talk about core beliefs. Most of the time, people talk about core beliefs as if it's a bad thing. Like there's these core beliefs that kind of hold us back. But I would imagine, we have to have core beliefs that are positive, that do positive things for us. You know, like
Yeah.
if like whatever. And it's so I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that. I mean, what do you think about core beliefs? Like, how do you think how powerful they are, or how can we change them,
I
or that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think our beliefs are super powerful. Like we kind of talked about limiting beliefs, and I think that like definitely our beliefs about ourselves, whether they're positive or negative, can impact how we choose to do things or our behaviors. And I think we talk about limiting beliefs a lot because I mean, I think a lot of people have them, and I think that
Mm-hmm.
they're usually the thing that become like an obstacle where it's like, oh, we have a limiting belief about like what we deserve or what we're capable of or whatever, and those become like obstacles to creating change or achieving or whatever. Whereas like I think that we can also have core beliefs that are like very positive, but we often don't discuss them as much because they're not getting in our way. And they're like, like I have a core belief that, everybody's like worthy of being respected. And so I treat people respectfully and I expect others to behave in this similar way. But I don't necessarily like spend a lot of time dissecting that belief because it doesn't like get in my way of anything. More often than not, it is a positive thing in my life. So I don't think I like, dwell on those like positive core beliefs the same way that people or like even me like dwell or spend time thinking about limiting beliefs, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, I like to think that I like operate when I have like more of the positive beliefs. I like to think of them more as like my values. It's like I value being authentic, or I value being um, vulnerable, or I value being whatever. Like I can't think of things off the top of my head right now, but I like to think of like my beliefs as something that maybe I can or might change. Whereas like
Mm-hmm.
I think of like my values as things of like these are integral components of me that I want to protect and maintain. Whereas beliefs I think can be more fluid or more changeable if they need to be.
Yeah. Well, I think this is important though, man, because I think like the limiting beliefs. So let's say the core beliefs that you have about yourself that are negative will hold you back. But
Hmm.
the core beliefs that you have about yourself that are empowering will push you forward. Because
Yeah.
I think a person having a limited belief that says uh they're not capable of doing something
Hmm.
and is very different from a person's core belief that is a empowering belief that says they are capable of doing whatever it is they set their mind to, or they set their dedication to. I think those are two
Hmm.
different things, because if you say that you have a limiting belief that is I can't do this thing, well, if you fix that limiting belief, that just brings you back to baseline wherever that is. You can do whatever the situation is. But if you say I am capable of doing the things that I dedicate myself to, I just feel like those are different. Um, and I think it's important to address limiting beliefs. I think it's important to be aware of what those are and fix those. But I think it's equally as important to understand what beliefs you have about yourself that are serving you, in the direction you want your life to go.
Hmm. I think that makes
Be,
sense.
and I'm actually, to be honest with you, this is the first time I'm actually thinking through this thought process, because I feel like a lot of people I've talked to, it is about the limiting beliefs. Like, what is it that's holding you back? What is it that you believe about yourself or your life or the people around you? What is it that you believe that's holding you back? Okay, that's one question. But like, what do you believe about yourself that is really pushing you forward? Like, and I think that's a whole nother question. Because if we
Hmm.
fix the limiting beliefs, like, yeah, that's good, but we're still going to only operate at like 50% if we don't know what it is that's pushing us forward. And I guess you could say, well, you could invert the beliefs. If you have a belief that you're not confident or not capable, you could invert that into a belief that you are confident and are competent and capable. But I don't know, man. I think it's just as important to be aware of like what serves us versus what don't, what doesn't.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Honestly, I mean, it probably depends on the people. Like, I think people who have maybe done a bit more self like reflection, done a bit more like internal work to try and figure out what those limiting beliefs are, change them, and stuff like that. I think people that have kind of explored that probably have a better idea of what their beliefs are about themselves that actually propel them forward. Whereas people who are really stuck in their like limiting beliefs and like haven't taken the opportunity or had the opportunity to like explore and try and get rid of those, I think it's a lot harder to identify the beliefs about yourself that are helping you and putting you forward when you're kind
Mm.
of stuck in those like limiting ones. If that like that's kind of how I see it anyway. I
Yeah,
think
that
when
does make sense. Well, I mean,
yeah.
and that's something else too that I've talked about, man. Like, if you, and this is one of the reasons that I like fitness, that I advocate for fitness the way that I do, because fitness is one of the things that you can set something for yourself. You can set a goal for yourself, and you can, progress towards this goal, and you can overcome these little battles. First of all, you can win these little mental battles with yourself, these little physical battles daily or 3 times, 5 times a week, whatever it is. But it also, as you're going towards the goal and as you're overcoming these things, it's I'm trying to think of a way to an example for this.
I think I have a pretty good idea of what you're getting at, and something that I often like to kind of use in this way is like when people are trying to overcome a limiting belief. One of the ways that I like to talk about like doing that is by looking for evidence of the contrary. So
Hmm.
like say I have a limiting belief. I think an example I've used before was like, oh, like I had a limiting belief when I was struggling in my business and I wasn't feeling like I was like getting a client or whatever. I had this limiting belief. I'm like, oh, I'm not like hard enough working. I don't, do enough. I don't do this or that or whatever. I'm not, I'm not, cut out to be like busy and successful or whatever. And that was like a limiting belief I had. Whereas like when I was trying to like change that, something that I would do is be like, okay, let's find evidence in my life that was contrary to that. And it's like, okay, well, I'm telling myself I'm not a good enough, like I'm not a hard enough worker, I'm not dedicated enough to like be successful in my career. But if I look back at like when I went to school, I did well, I got good grades, like I got my shit done. Um, and that's evidence that like, no, I am a hard worker. And so like
Mm-hmm.
I often will use that being like, hey, find the evidence that you are actually this thing when you're telling yourself you're not. And that like for me, I think is a really good shift for people is like, okay, you actually have to like take a bit of an inventory of yourself and look for like, there's almost always evidence that you are capable or you are, worthy or you are this or you are that. But we don't look at that when we're looking at, you know, when we're stuck somewhere. So I find that like evidence seeking is really valuable way of sort of shifting that. And like in terms of fitness, or exercise or working out, like it's really easy to look back and be like, oh, there is evidence that I'm like strong or that I'm capable. Like, look, when I first started this, I couldn't lift whatever, or I was only able to like get a couple things done in an hour. And now I can look back and find this evidence where I'm like, now I can do this, or now I am capable of like getting a whole bunch of stuff done in this hour or whatever. So like I think there's like really valuable information in those experiences where you can kind of like reflect back and be like, I did that thing, so I am capable of doing this thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a pretty good example, man. The example I wanted to use was about the scale, was about weight, but I tell people to stay off the scale because I think the scale is very misleading. Because if you're in the
Mm-hmm.
gym and if it depends on the kind of workout you're doing, you can actually build muscle, which is gonna add some weight to the scale. So I didn't want to go down that route, but I like the way that you I like the example you gave because not just fitness, like whether it's career or whatever, it's like these little victories, man. When you do these consistently, it makes an uphill spiral, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like a positive feedback loop for the things that you've done prior to that. And I like the way that you talk about it because you can look back and reference these things like, oh, maybe I wasn't in this exact situation, but I was in a similar situation, and this is how I handled that, so I feel sure I can handle this. And that's what I'm saying. It gives you those little battles to overcome, and it's like if you look at a staircase that's like 100 steps, we think about like getting to this top step as the most important thing, but that every step is as equally as important as the other. I would argue the first step is the most important step, but every step along that staircase serves a purpose. And it's like when you get to the top, that 100th step, maybe that's when you feel like you've achieved the goal, but it's like every single thing that you had that happened up to that point is just as important as that. And so
Yeah.
it's, I think that's what you were talking earlier about people going to the gym for the first time or starting anything for the first time. I think one of the things that makes it so intimidating is it seems like it's so far away. But if we look at if we look at how each step is unique and how each step is needed in the process, because this is something else I preach on a lot is the process, how each step is fundamental to where it's at, and it is there for a reason. It serves a purpose, and you have to take each step to get closer to that top step.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why, talking about the process for a second, this is why I talk so much about the process, because we want this goal, we want this thing, we want to be somewhere, but I think social media has done a fantastic job of this, making it seem like this is an overnight thing. You
Mm-hmm.
can go from step 0 to step 99 and then 100, and then you're there. The problem with that, I mean, I think the problem is obvious, but like the problem with that is you can't make a leap like that. I was talking to my last guest about this. You can't make a leap like that and be the person who can stand on step 100 because you didn't go through the other 99 steps. It's the
Yeah.
process who builds you into who you are. That's the person who's capable of being at that goal.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like it's one of the things that I like to try and talk to my clients about and just like talk about in general is this concept of like celebrating all the little wins along the way. Because a lot of times, like especially, like fitness industry is really big on like advertising dramatic results in short time periods, which
Yep.
are, I mean, a whole other conversation is about how like typically unrealistic and unhealthy a lot of that is. But at the same time, it's like if you are here and you're like, yeah, it's your first day at the gym and you picture what this end result is supposed to look like. And, as you're moving along the way, it still seems like it's far away. If you don't celebrate all the little steps you took or all the little wins you took, then this keeps feeling really far away and it doesn't feel like you're making any progress. But if you can like look back and be like, oh, good job, me. Like, I showed up to the gym twice this week, and
Yep.
prior to that, I hadn't showed up at all. Like, those are big, big accomplishments, and like people often don't give themselves enough credit for those little steps throughout the process of actually like building it up and creating the consistency and creating that success over the longer term versus like looking at that end point and being like, this is success. Whereas like all these little steps you took along the way are also very good indicators of success.
Yeah. Well, you hit the nail on the head, man. You said consistency. And I think the only way to stay consistent with anything is to show yourself progress, to show yourself results. Because
Mm-hmm.
if you're trying to get to from A to B and you don't see any progress along the way, I think that's why most people quit. I think that's why most people probably quit the first few months of doing anything. I mean, anything
Mm-hmm.
that's going to be worthwhile. But I think you're right. I think it is important to see the little wins that you have along the way, because those wins are going to motivate you and keep you consistent in what you're doing. And, over time, man, what I've seen is anything that I've tried to do in my life that I feel like has something that I'm trying to build that has value, it has come from being consistent and being in that process. And eventually, for me, for a lot of the things I've tried to do in my life, it's like eventually you tell yourself, okay, I'm the person who like does these things. Like,
Hmm.
when I started working out, this is just an easy example. When I started working out, I wanted to put on some muscle and all that. But eventually it was like, I mean, yes, that's kind of still the goal, but now it's like being that person who's just like who does that. That's just part of my day.
Hmm.
That's just part of what I do. And I feel like this is kind of what I was asking you earlier about the identity part. It kind of tying this all in full circle. If you are the person who, if say like entrepreneurship, which is a very demanding career to be in, if you are the person who does the things that successful entrepreneurship does, that they do, that makes it successful, it's going to help you be consistent with the process versus if you're
Hmm.
just like looking at a goal that you have X revenue, whatever. it, I'm not going to say it's going to be impossible, but it's going to be much more difficult if you're not looking at the process along the way. And we can talk all day about motivation and getting started and discipline, but like that consistency, like, is going to be everything. Because
Hmm.
if you do something, you can do something for 4 hours a day, every single day, and you're going to beat the person who's doing it for 16 hours a day once a week. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just what it comes down to is consistency.
Yeah, totally. And that's like kind of to add to that, something that I think is really important when people, like when I talk to my clients again, it's like consistency is often made up of like trying to figure out what's going to be the most realistic way for you to do this. Whereas like a lot of times people are like, I need to like just dive in head first and
Mm,
go for it. And a lot of the times that's like you said, people fall off in the first couple weeks, couple months or whatever because they're going and they're not seeing the result they want. And instead of like keeping at it, they've like done too much or they'll burn themselves out or whatever and then they just give up. They're frustrated. Whereas like if you build that consistency by actually like taking those like smaller steps or like taking like a piece and doing like, oh, instead of jumping into, like you said, 16 hours a day once a week, or instead of jumping into like 5 days a week of working out, let's just start with like one or two and
yep.
build that consistency up. You're going to see more benefit from doing something every week 2 times than you
Hmm.
are for doing something 4 times a week for 4 weeks and then burning yourself out and quitting. So it's
Yep.
like finding those like achievable milestones and sticking to them instead of like trying to jump to the end.
Yeah, that's perfect, man. I love the way you said that because it makes it real. It makes it realistic. When you break it down into little bite-sized chunks, basically, it makes it more realistic.
Yeah.
And that's something I talk about too, man, is just make it something that works for you. Somebody else
Hmm.
might be in there every single day, and like that doesn't mean that's what you have to do.
Hmm.
And this is not even just about the gym. I was talking to somebody else about this the other day. Just because somebody wakes up at 5 a.m. doesn't mean that you have to wake up at 5 a.m. If that's you have to find what works for you, dude, because if it doesn't work for you, you're not going to be consistent with it. You're going to try it for a little bit and then you're going to quit because it's not going to work for you. Some
Exactly.
people are just have different circadian rhythms. They work better in the afternoon and night. Some people work better in the morning. I'm not saying if you're trying to do something like that you're going to have early mornings, but that you won't have early mornings, but you have to find what works for you because it's got to be something that you can be consistent at. And I
Yeah.
wish that's something that, even because this year will be 10 years since I've, into this entrepreneurship thing for me. I've been an entrepreneur for about 10 years now. And I wish somebody would have told me that, in the early beginning stage of this, that you do not have to, there's plenty of blueprints that you can follow if you want, like this thing worked for this person, this thing worked for this person. But you do not have to follow a blueprint that worked for somebody else if following that blueprint is going to be counterproductive for you. I mean, you have
Hmm.
to find what works for you and what is set up best for how you are and for your life because you have to be able to be consistent at it. I mean, you
Yeah.
can't, that's all it comes down to is be consistent.
Yeah. I agree. I think I can't remember where I was given this advice or where this came from, but I remember like a lot of time people like struggle with being like bit of a perfectionist. They're like, I'm going to do this thing, so I have to do it like exactly this way. It has to be perfect. And if it's not perfect, then somehow I failed. And like one of the most important things I think somebody told me is like, just take action. Imperfect action is better than no action. If you're always waiting for something to be perfect or being like exactly the right way or following like this specific guideline rather than just like doing what you can, you're gonna you're gonna see more success if you take like action that's doable for you rather than trying to be like perfect all the
I love that. That makes a lot of sense. I think that being perfect thing is another thing too, man, because there's going to be so many roadblocks along the way, so many obstacles,
time.
so many things that's going to want to make you quit. And this is what I say too. And I know it sounds simple, it sounds cliche to have a why, a reason why you're doing what you're doing. But if you can't look back and reference a purpose that's bigger than you, that why you're doing what you're doing, at some point along the path of anything that you're trying to build in life, something's going to come along that's much bigger than you, that's much stronger than you, that's much more intimidating than you. And it is going to test how bad you really want whatever it is you're working towards. And if you don't have a purpose, have a sense of why that it is that you're doing the thing that you're doing, it's going to be difficult to just push through that just solely on motivation or even discipline. I mean, I'm a big discipline advocate. I think that discipline is something that really sets the direction for our life. But if you don't know why you are disciplined, if you don't know what the reason behind your discipline is, you have to have something that keeps pushing you forward when that thing that comes around to test you comes around to test you.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's definitely like there has to be like a personal connection to what you're doing for it to be, something that you're actually going to successfully stick to and achieve that consistency.
Mm-hmm. Andrea, something I wanted to ask you about, kind of to change gears here for a minute. So we were talking about nutrition at the first part of this. Do you do anything with supplements, like supplementation? Do you go down that route?
Um, yes and no. Like I don't necessarily like emphasize it. I don't like, really emphasize it with my clients unless they're curious or unless there's like a specific concern. For me personally, I like to keep it simple. Like I do believe in supplementation because but what I like to think of it as like supplementation is exactly that. Like it's supplementary. Like it's not
Mm,
something I feel like I need to rely on per se,
right.
but it's like I like to think of it as sort of like an insurance policy. Whereas like, if I'm not eating or consuming everything that I need to consume, which I probably am not always because I like to make sure that I have freedom in my eating so that I don't feel restricted. But I like to have a certain amount of supplementation like in my routine so that way I can kind of ensure that my body is still getting, the bare minimum or like the basics, even if my eating is missing things. So like I do believe in it, but I don't like to put it at the forefront of anything. Like for me, if I'm supplementing, it's like I have some fruit and veggie supplements. I have some omegas. I have like up where I live, it's dark a lot in the wintertime. Vitamin D is really important. Stuff like that. Or like, I had like a blood panel done with my doctor recently and I saw my iron was like maybe not at the best place. So supplement with stuff like that. Or like if I do a lot of exercise in a day, I'll also try to get some extra protein. But I like to keep my focus on supplements quite simple and really just as sort of like that baseline. I'm taking these just in case I'm not getting enough from my diet, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a pretty good plan because regardless of what we might be led to believe, there's not like if you lose sleep, if you're not eating right, a pill is not going to change that. And the protein, I like whey protein, like the shakes or whatever, but protein from a meal is going to be much better than a shake. So I think the way you said it, an insurance policy, I think that's a good way to put it. Um,
Yeah.
so something I wanted to ask you about, I know we only got about half an hour or so left on this thing. If you had to kind of help somebody that was like in that spot, like just trying to get in the gym, somebody who was really intimidated, what do you think? What do you think you would tell them? Like, how do you help a person get through initial, I guess, fear maybe?
Well, I mean, it's going to depend a little bit on the circumstances. Like if it's like somebody's coming to me as a professional and they're like, "Hey, I'm really uncomfortable," like I'm gonna meet with them personally and I'm gonna like walk them through things. But if it's like somebody who's, like a friend or whatever, and maybe they're not trying to hire me, but they're just like struggling, it's gonna be a little bit different. But ultimately, like I'll try to reassure people, kind of what we had talked about before, like more often than that, not nobody that's in the gym is actually paying attention to you. They're paying attention to themselves. And if they are paying attention to you and not themselves, then they're kind of a dick and you don't want to care about their opinion anyway.
Right.
But a lot of it too is like, for me, I think the way that I help people get more comfortable in the gym, especially if they've been really apprehensive in the first place, is like trying to build their confidence in themselves. So like building some knowledge base, getting people feeling like I know how to do things properly. I know where things are. I have a bit of a plan. So that way when I walk in, I don't feel like a deer in headlights looking around like, where's all the stuff? And then, I like to combine that like base knowledge with just like that reassurance that most people have been uncomfortable here at some point, and like try to relate to them on that like same level that I felt really uncomfortable, and try to make sure that they know that that's like a normal experience, that like a lot of people go through that like intimidation at the gym. And yeah, just like again, kind of going with that vulnerability, going with that like sharing that they're not alone in this experience. Um, but yeah, pairing that with that sort of base knowledge of being like, okay, let's get you comfortable here. Let's get you situated. Let's like, if somebody isn't coming to meet me at the gym personally, but they're going to go to another gym, like I would probably tell them to like scope it out in advance, get a lay of the land, like figure out where the equipment is, and like before they even go to the gym, pick out what they're going to do. So that way they don't get there feeling overwhelmed. And then even then, like having some swaps, like if equipment's unavailable, having another idea that they can pull from. Just like those basic things, I think can be really helpful for people who are feeling intimidated in the gym.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned something in there about self-confidence, and I don't know if this is an area that you focus on. Do you work with people building self-confidence?
I believe so. Like, I mean, it's not necessarily like I'm directly coaching them through confidence per se, but
Hmm.
I think that building like self-efficacy in like what they're capable of, and building even building strength like in the gym, I think like there's a lot of components to what I do are geared toward helping somebody feel more confident. And I think a lot of that is just like feeling safe, feeling like they have a bit of a like understanding, knowing what they need to do, kind of having like a purpose. I think a lot of those things translate into building overall confidence.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I was just curious to get your thoughts on that because so I feel like self-confidence is another one of those things you can, ask 10 different people about self-confidence and there's 10 different answers. So
Hmm.
I was curious to get your take on that. Um,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I think you're right. Like, I think confidence means different things to different people.
Hmm.
Um, so I think it really can be very situationally dependent.
Yeah, well, what I always tell people, like my definition of confidence is like keeping the promises that you make to yourself. Like when you
Hmm.
do that over time, you will build trust and integrity with yourself. And I think by definition, what self confidence is being able to rely and depend on yourself and what you think and what you believe, or at the very least, being able to have who you are and what you believe and what you think tested and being able to be stand firm in your beliefs. And I think the only way to do that is to trust yourself, is to prove yourself to yourself, which is
Yeah.
why it's such an important thing to say, if I'm going to do something on a certain day, you might think you're lying to your gym partner or your coworker or whoever it is, but you're really lying to yourself, man, because if you can't trust yourself to do the things you got to do, who can you really trust, and
Yeah.
it's like the ice bath. Like if I tell myself I'm gonna do the ice bath tomorrow and I don't do it, you do that enough time over a long enough time, man, you can't trust yourself.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I've had somebody kind of talk to me about that before. Like the idea of keeping promises yourself is definitely like a big part of confidence. I think the other thing that I like to look at with confidence is I also think it's really directly tied to like self-worth too. So it's
Hmm.
like if I believe I deserve a certain type of thing, if I stand firmly and believe in like I deserve to be treated respectfully, I deserve to be like loved, I deserve to, pursue my goals. If I believe that I am worthy of these things, then stepping out into the world, like believing in my own self worth is going to, and then being willing to like stand firm and not accept less than that, I think also is a really big part of building confidence as well.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good point. Um, so Andrea, before we close this thing out, I want to make sure we have time for this. Where can people find you? Do you have like a do you have a social media, and also do you work with people virtually? Like, is this something that you do virtual?
I do, yeah. So I work both like one-on-one in person, and I also work with people virtually. So like over Zoom typically. So people can find me. My website is workofartcoaching.ca. Sorry, I said that funny. Workofartcoaching.ca. So it's all one word. And then on Instagram, they can find me at Work of Art YEG. YEG is for Edmonton.
Okay.
Hmm.
So one thing that I ask everybody before we close out is to share one of the most important lessons they've ever learned. It can be through fitness or through career, through your personal journey, if it's something you're comfortable sharing. What do you think would be one of the most important lessons you've ever learned, or maybe the most invaluable lessons you've ever learned?
You know what? I think I kind of touched on this before, but one of the most valuable lessons I think I've learned is partly related to that choosing my discomfort, like being able to choose where I'm going to be comfortable experiencing discomfort and why, and then acting in a way that's going to like serve me in the future. That lesson kind of came to me through an experience of learning to set boundaries, actually, where I had somebody come into my life that was not particularly respectful of my boundaries and didn't make me feel comfortable. And when it was happening in the time, I didn't know how to react. I didn't know what to say. I kind of just like would shut down and sort of wait for them to go away and try to ignore them, and that sort of thing didn't work. They would just keep popping up and kept making me uncomfortable. And so I kind of like learned that whole concept of choosing my discomfort was in an idea of like I need to set a boundary with this person and be like, look, you can't just show up, or you can't, be in my life in this particular way because it doesn't make me feel comfortable. And I was really uncomfortable with telling this person like no, or setting a boundary with that person. And in general, like in life, setting boundaries was really difficult for me. So finding like that concept of choosing the discomfort of like setting the boundary is really uncomfortable, but it's going to make me feel better later. It's going to serve me. It's going to protect me by doing that, rather than choosing the discomfort of like allowing, someone to step over my boundaries. So I think it's kind of a combo of like boundaries, I think are a really important lesson for me, but also just that idea of knowing what type of discomfort is going to create a longer term benefit for me and pursuing that instead of the alternative.
Yeah, those are some pretty profound lessons, man. Um, I'm just thinking, because it's like hearing you say this, it's like choosing your discomfort. It's like you had, 15 minutes or something of discomfort for potentially a lifetime of comfort because of this conversation, or you can like prolong the conversation and not have it, and then have a potentially lifetime of discomfort. And I think
Yeah.
I think that's the thing about this discomfort thing, man, is a lot of times like it's difficult kind of going into it on the front end, but a lot of times it's not really, if you look at it versus doing the thing that's uncomfortable initially versus not doing it, it's like the initial discomfort lasts a lot less than what the discomfort would be if you didn't do that. You know.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like sometimes that initial discomfort might even be like bigger, but
Mhm.
it's ultimately like shorter term and has more benefits in the long run.
Yeah. And then, I guess if you do that over time, the idea is that you will, first of all, you're the person that can do difficult things. And that's already something in itself. And then you're like setting up your future self for, I don't want to say a life of comfort, because I don't think that ever exists truly, but it's like,
Mhm.
it's certainly a better situation than if you didn't, like in your case, if you didn't have the conversation or set the boundaries or whatever it was.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, ultimately doing so not only like changes the circumstance because, you've set a boundary or you've done whatever you needed to do to like create a change, but it also kind of comes back to that sort of same thing you were saying about like you kept a promise to yourself when you choose that type of discomfort and you're like, I've made a decision that serves me, and by sticking with it, you also, I think, build that like self-worth and that self-confidence and all of that stuff that goes with it by proving to yourself that like you can do the hard thing.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Hmm.
And you mentioned something else too, man, about boundaries. I think that's a big one. I think that's a big one that a lot of people have issues with because, especially like the people that I've seen and interacted with personally in life, it's not even about um, it's not even about like random people. It's really about like family members is what I've seen it a lot of with a lot of people. And for me, I don't feel like I've ever kind of had that. This is another thing going back to what we talked about earlier. I don't feel like I've ever kind of had that experience. So it's hard for me to resonate with the person that's kind of in that situation. Cause I mean, my answer to it is, look, just tell this person not to do this, or you can't do this. But I understand that's not like, that's an oversimplification of the process of the problem. I understand that. Um,
Hmm.
but it's just like, man, I just, if there was one thing I wish I could just instill in people, it would be, what is it? I guess maybe self-confidence enough to set that. I don't know what it is even. Like what is the thing that doesn't let people set boundaries? Is it self-confidence or is it?
I think it's a bit of a mixture. Like I think sometimes being, hesitant to set boundaries can be a little bit about like not feeling like you deserve to have it respected. I think it can come down a little bit to that like self-worth. But I also think that like for me anyway, it comes down a lot to like the idea of people pleasing and the idea of
Mm,
like putting someone else's comfort before your own. Whereas like it feels like I'm like put others first and you want other people to feel good and like that sounds nice, but putting somebody else's comfort over top of like or sorry, like prioritizing the way someone else feels over the way you feel can be like if you're doing that in a way that's detrimental to yourself, it's not going to be helpful. Like it's probably not even good for that person to like feel like to get, put above you. It takes away from your experience. It takes away from your quality of life when you put someone else's feelings above you. And I think a lot of the time boundaries are about putting yourself above or like putting your experience ahead of that person's experience. And sometimes that's really uncomfortable for people because we don't want to make someone else uncomfortable. We'd rather
yeah.
be uncomfortable ourselves than make someone else uncomfortable. And that's like a pretty hard thing to overcome.
Well, I mean, it is, man. And I think, one of the things about that is that like people can't trust, the thing about people pleasing is people can't trust you if you're just trying to say or do whatever to please this person because you're not really doing what it is or saying what it is that you really want to do. I mean,
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to be said about a person who just 100% all the time wants to hear somebody praise them or some sort of compliment. Like that, I don't even want to use the word that describes that, but it's because it's way overused. But like just a narcissistic person would be like the person who just thrives on that kind of thing. But I think a
Yeah.
lot of people, I don't know what percentage. I guess it would depend on the person, but I would imagine that people want to hear your honest opinion. Like, what is it that you really think? What is it that you really want? Because if you're going to have like, especially like an intimate relationship or something that you're close with like that, I don't see how you can grow and progress forward if you don't know that about the person. Like I just imagine it's a very particular, possibly even unhealthy type of person to be around that just always wants to hear, you know, you say positive things about them. I mean, sometimes, man, you just gotta put a person in their place, be like, look, dude, this is what you're doing, and this is not okay, you know.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, going back to that original thing, having that discomfort, that uncomfortable conversation. I don't know.
Hmm.
I know me personally, man. I want to know like what is a person it depends on the interaction, the relationship with them, but I'm like, what's going on with you? You know, where are you at? How do you feel? What do you think? And unfortunately, I think the people pleasing thing, from what I've seen on the outside looking in, it's like a cycle, because these people think that they think what they're doing is being respectful and being, you know, appropriate with the person. But it's like, at the end of the day, man, sometimes they're the one that's taken advantage of because they're not, you know, setting their own boundaries, basically.
Yeah, totally. Like, I mean, I think people pleasing can have a bit of like, it can definitely be coming from like trying to make other people happy, trying to make other people happy all the time. And like, sometimes that sounds really positive, but also I think sometimes it can be like a defense mechanism. They're like, it's like, I'm afraid of negative reactions, or I'm accustomed to negative reactions. So I've developed the skill of people pleasing because it's protected me from these reactions in a different situation. But now I'm in this situation and I don't need to do that anymore. And it's like it's hard to make that shift when you kind of like step into like, you know, you're in a safer situation and you don't actually need to protect yourself. You need to put up a boundaries and do something else. So it can be
Mm-hmm.
really interesting to delve into that.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Andrea, listen, man, I've appreciated the conversation today. Appreciated your insight on some things. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that maybe you wanted to cover?
I don't think so. I think we hit on all the major points.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes I try to stay organized with this thing, man, but like I tell people a lot of times, like that, like it's almost like I have to kind of filter what I'm saying, because it's like if you think about a dam like holding back a rushing river, sometimes that's just like what my thoughts are. And I'm trying to like be organized, and I want to be respectful of you guys' time, which is why I try not to go down too many rabbit holes. But yeah, so I try to, you know, stick it to what we want to talk about and where we're at. But yeah, this has been a great conversation, man. I appreciate it. And if you want to send me the links, any kind of links you have, I'll attach them to the videos.
Sure, yeah.
But let me close this thing out. Hang out for just a second. Let me close the video out, and
Sure.
and we'll go from there. But I definitely appreciate your time, man.
Yeah, no worries.
Hey, listen, guys, I really appreciate you tuning in today. If you enjoyed this podcast, if you found it useful or beneficial, you can subscribe, follow, interact, and see more content at Pure Wisdom Podcast. This is all social medias: Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Rumble, Spotify, Amazon Music, and Google and Apple Podcasts. Again, we appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you next time.